the case of the Spelunkian explorers. A group of cave explorers are trapped by a landslide.
We are very tired.
So tiring.
Bro, nice cave.
I know, right?
Really nice. I can't say anything.
We hit the jackpot, lads.
Yes.
Nice.
Where is the light? Where is the cave?
Can't see anything.
Yes.
Approaching starvation, they make video contact with the rescue team.
Push, bro. That's right.
Is it over yet?
Yeah, I think so. Oh my God, there was a very big landslide. Oh my.
The explorers made contact with the rescue team. Ready, rescue team.
Hello, hello.
Guys, I think we have a device. Call.
What device?
What device? Two device. One only, bro. Tuk.
Hello, hello, can you hear me?
Guys, there's a girl.
Hello?
Text message. Hi. Talk.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
How are you doing in there?
Why?
Not too bad. Bit hungry today. How are you? This is fitting. Sorry, may we know who are you?
Oh, I'm an engineer at the site, here to rescue you all.
Oh, my name is Tommy. I'm here with Roger and 4 friends.
Hi Tommy, it's good to know that you all are still doing well.
We're not really doing well. We're very hungry. And we have no food. It's
We
been
are
20
here to
days.
rescue all of you.
Thank you so much.
Engineers on the rescue team estimate that the rescue will take a further 10 days.
Oh my God, 10 days.
Are you sure it's going to take 10 days?
They said we're expecting a further landslide too, but it wouldn't be too bad.
Roger, 10 days. Wait.
Can I get in contact with the physician?
Yeah, sure, hold on, there's someone here.
Yes, I'm the physician in charge.
So it's
Are
been.
you all okay?
Here's the situation. It's been 20 days, and the situation is scarce. We don't have anything to eat. So how long more will we be stuck here?
Well, after a long time of calculating and whatnot, I think you will be still stuck there for at least 10 days.
Yes.
Oh my God.
I'm so sorry guys, our workmen, we have already lost 10 people while trying to get you out. So we're doing the best we can do.
After describing their situation to physicians, they are told it is unlikely that they will survive another 10 days without food. The explorers asked the physicians whether they would survive if they killed and ate one of their number.
How about we?
Wait. So in determining first on who will
This
be
is a very
eaten,
good meat.
before that, I think we have to do this by chance.
By chance? What do you mean by chance? What do we have?
Let's let Tari let.
Let's. Oh my God. We use our feet.
Okay.
Tan tut. Let me count. You count. Tan tut ke dah 2 sampai dengan dia mati dulu. Huh? This is good meat.
Wait, I take back. I take it back.
Ah,
Are you okay with this selection?
yes, okay.
Are you okay with this selection?
I
The
agree
way
with
we've done this?
We are okay with this.
We are very okay.
As long as you all survive, I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
I'm not here like we hit him.
Sama
Too quick.
But it's not.
No.
But it's not.
Go downstairs. Oh no.
We are very hungry.
The radio is turned off and later a lottery is held. The loser is killed and eaten.
That's a very delicious meat.
When they are rescued, they are prosecuted for murder, for which, in the Commonwealth of Yukon, a guilty verdict carries a mandatory sentence of capital punishment. Court in session.
appears to me that the jury and the trial judge took a fair and wise course, and that course was the only one which was open to them. Because the plain language of our statute is well known. This statute permits no exception, even for an extraordinary case like this, regardless of how we sympathize with these defendants. We cannot make an exception, even in this case. However, the most legitimate way to mitigate the rigors of the law is to resort to the principle of executive clemency, just like how the jury and the trial judge did. There is every reason to believe that these requests for clemency will be heeded by the chief executive, and it is highly improbable that the chief executive would deny this request for clemency. I think we may therefore assume that some form of clemency will be extended to these defendants. If this is done, then justice will be accomplished without impairing either the letter or spirit of the law, and without offering any encouragement for the disregard of law. With this, the convictions of the defendants are affirmed.
I believe that these 4 brave men shall not be considered as murder, and on the contrary, that is declared them to be innocent of any crime, based on 2 grounds. The first ground was on the premise that the enacted or positive law, including all of its statutes and precedent, is inapplicable to this case. The legal maxim cessante ration legis cessat et ipsa lex means that the reason for law ceasing is the law itself cease. Our positive law is enacted on the possibility of man coexistence in society. When a situation arises in which the coexistence of man becomes impossible, then a condition that underlies all of our precedents and statute has ceased to exist. The usual conditions of human existence incline us to think that all human life has an absolute value, not to be sacrificed under any circumstances. But in the situations of these 4 men, the situations, the circumstances change. If these things can be said of a society functioning above ground in a normal, ordinary manner, what shall we say of the supposed absolute value of human life in a desperate situation in which this defendant and their companion Whitmore found themselves? So on the second ground is based my second ground proceed by rejecting hypothetically all the premise on which I have so far proceeded. It is clear that these men, all of these 4 men, had violated the literal wording of the statute, which is no one shall take another's life. However, every proposition of positive law, whether contained in a statute or judicial precedent, is to be interpreted reasonably in the light of evident purpose. The statute before us for interpretation has never been applied literally. For example, in the case of self-defense, where a person killed the one who oppressed them, is it considered as a murder or not? Then a man whose life is threatened will repel his aggressor, whatever the law may say. When the rationale of the accused of self-defense is explained, therefore it becomes the same as the situation with our 4 defendants. And therefore I believe that the conviction should be set aside and these 4 defendants is not guilty.
So, as for me, I
as rendered by my brother Foster, I find that it is shot through with contradiction and fallacies. Let us begin with his first proposition. These men were not subject to our law because they were not in a state of civil society but in a state of nature. Other difficulties intrude themselves. If these men pass from the jurisdiction of our law to that of the law of nature, at what moment did this occur? Was it when the entrance to the cave was blocked? Or when the threat of starvation reached a certain undefined degree of intensity? Or when the agreement for the throwing of the dice was made? This, on what date would we have to consider that he had attained his majority when he reached the age of 21, at which time he was, by hypothesis, removed from the effects of our law, or only when he was released from the cave and became again subject to what we call positive law? But it is not necessary to explore these niceties further to demonstrate the absurdity of my brother's position, because I and Mr. Justice Foster are the appointed judges of the Court of Commonwealth of Newgate, sworn and empowered to administer the law of the Commonwealth. By the what authority do we resolve ourselves into the court of nature? If these men were indeed under the law of nature, whence comes our authority to expound and apply that law? Certainly, we are not in the state of nature. For the code of nature that my brother proposed to adopt as our own and apply to this case, it is code in which the law of contract is more fundamental than the law of murder. It is code under which a man may make a valid agreement, empowering his fellows to eat his own body. Under the provision of this code, furthermore, such an agreement once made is irrevocable, and if one of the parties attempts to withdraw, the others may take the law into their own hands and enforce the contract by violence, for though my brother passes over in convenient silence in the effects of Whitemore withdrawal. This is necessarily implication of his argument. So, my brother argues that when the defendants set upon Whitemore and kill him, we don't know how, but perhaps by pounding him with stones, they were only exercising the right conferred upon them by their bargain. Suppose, however, that Whitmore had concealed upon his person a revolver, and that when he saw the defendants about to slaughter him, he had shot them to death in order to save his own life. My brother's reasoning applied to these facts would make Whitmore out to be a murderer, since the excuse of self-defense would have to be denied to him. If his assailants were acting rightfully in seeking to bring about his death, then of course he could not more plead the excuse that he was defending his own life than could be a condemned prisoner who struck down the executioner lawfully attempting to place the noose about his neck. I can neither accept this notion of these men were under the code of nature, which this court was bound to apply to them, nor I can accept the odious and perverted rules that he would read into that code. Now, for the second part is, in which my brother seeks that to show that the defendant did not violate the provision of NCSA. Here, this is why. The gist of my brother's argument may be stated in the following terms. No statute, whether its language, should be applied in the way that contradicts its purpose. One of the purposes of any criminal statute is to deter. The application of the statute making it is a crime to kill another to peculiar facts of this case would contradict to this purpose, for it is impossible to believe that the contents of criminal code could operate in deterrent manner of man faced with the alternative of life or death. The reasoning by which this exception is read into the statute is, my brother observed, the same as that which is applied in order to provide the excuse self-defense. my brother's interpretation of the rationale of the excuse of self-defense in effect supported by the decision of this court, which is Commonwealth against Perry. It is support generally to have been to the Commonwealth against Perry seems generally to have been overlooked in the text and subsequent decision. It is true that a statute should be applied in the light of its purpose, that one of the purposes of criminal legislation is recognized to be deterrence. The difficulty is that other purposes are also ascribed to the law of crime. It has been said that one of its objects is to provide an orderly outlet for the instinctive human demand for retribution. This is Commonwealth against Cape. It has also been said that its object is the rehabilitation of the wrongdoer. Commonwealth against Makeover are the theories that have been propounded. Assuming that we have interpreted a statute in the light of its purpose, what are we to do when it has many purposes or when its purposes are disputed? A similar difficulty is presented by the fact that although that there is an authority for my brother's interpretation of the excuse of self-defense, there is other authority which assign to the excuse of different rationale. The statute concerning murder requires a willful act. The man who acts to repel an aggressive threat to his own life does not act willfully, but in response to an impulse deeply ingrained in human nature. Now, the family explanation for the excuse of self-defense just expounded obviously cannot be applied by analogy to the facts of this case. This man acted not only willfully, but with great deliberation and after hours of discussing what they should do. I recognize the relevance of this precedent cited by my brother concerning the displaced knot and the defendants who part over time. But what are we to do with the one of the landmark of our jurisprudence, which again my brother passes over in silence? This is Commonwealth against Valjean. It appeared that the defendant was indicted for the larceny of a loaf of bread and offered as a defense that he was in condition approaching starvation. The court refused to accept this defense. If hunger cannot justify the theft and of wholesome and natural food, how can it justify a killing and eating a man? My brother's demonstration would compel us to overrule Commonwealth against Belgium and many other precedents that have been built on the case. Again, I have difficulty in saying that no deterrence effect, whatever could be attributed to a decision that these men were guilty of murder. I believe that if this man had known that their act was deemed by the law to be murder, they would have waited for a few days at least before carrying out their plan. During that time, some unexpected relief might have come. I realize that this observation only reduces the distinction to a matter of degree and does not destroy it altogether. It is certainly true that the element of deterrence will be less in this case than it normally involved in the application of this criminal law. So, what shall be the scope of this exception? Here the man cast lot and the victim was himself originally a party to the agreement. What would we have to decide if Wetmore had refused from the beginning to participate in the plan? Would a majority be permitted to overrule him? Or suppose that no plan were adopted at all and the others simply conspired to bring about Wetmore's death, justifying their act by saying that he was in the weakest condition? Or again, that a plan of selection was followed by one based on the different justification, then one adopted here, as if the other were atheists and insisted that Wetmore should die because he was the only one who believed in an afterlife. So, for the conclusion, since I have been wholly unable to resolve the doubt that beset me about the law of this case, I am with regret announcing a step that is, I believe, unprecedented in history of this tribunal. I declare my withdrawal from the decision of this case. Yes.
Oh. Thank you. Finally.
I should like to begin my judgment with imposing two questions which are not before this court. The first question is whether the executive clemency should be extended to this defendant if the conviction is affirmed. Under our system of a government, this question is under Chief of Executive, not first. Thus, in discharge of my duties as judge, it is neither my function to address the direction of Chief Justice. Thus, I will not answer this question. The second question is whether this man did was right, wrong, wicked, or good. This question is also irrelevant because in discharge of my office as a judge, I have sworn to apply not to conception of morality but the law of the land. So I can safely dismiss this question. So the sole question before us for the decision is whether the defendant did whether the meaning of the statute willfully take life of Roger Whitmore. The exact language will be whoever shall willfully take life of another shall be punished by death. The difficulties arises from this case is a failure to distinguish the legal from moral aspect of the case. To be honest, my brothers doesn't like the fact that the written law requires the conviction of this defendant. But unlike my brothers, I respect my obligation of the office, require me to put my personal bias out of my mind while I interpret and apply the law. Now, my brother Foster does like to admit that he actuated by personal dislike of written law. He developed a familiar argument which is something not contained in the statute itself called purpose that he implied to justify the result of the court considered proper. Now, we know there is a principle which is the supremacy of legislative branch of our government. From that principle, the obligation of judiciary to enforce faithfully the written law, to interpret the law in accordance with its plain meaning without reference to our personal desire or our individual perception of justice. Although this principle of supremacy of legislature has been accepted by centuries, but many of judiciary are not accommodated themselves to restrictive role, which the new order imposes on them. I will use Justice Foster as the example of judiciary reform of this favored legislative enactment. So, there is process of judicial reform require 3 steps. The first step is to find the purpose, and the second step is to find the gap, and the third step is to fill the blank and fill the gap. But in this case, I doubt very much whether our statute making a murder a crime really has purpose in any ordinary sense of the term. If we don't know the purpose of the act, how we can possibly say there is a gap? How we can know that its draftman of the statute thought about killing men in order to eat them? Perhaps it was for the very reason that our ancestors expressed their prohibitions brought in unqualified form. Thus, it remains clear that neither I or my brother knows what the purpose is. In applying self-defense in this case, which is played a large role in reasoning of my brothers Foster and Tate, it is true in the case of Commonwealth and Perry, dictum justified this exception on assumption that a purpose of criminal legislation is to deter. But in dealing with the statute, the question arises is not about the conjectural purposes, but its scope. The scope of the exception in favor of self-defense being applied within its plain meaning, which is it's applied to the cases where resisting to a person who resisting an aggressive threat to the party's own life, which is so clear in this case that Roger Whitmore does not make any threat to the life of this defendant. So, the attempt of my brothers Foster's in remaking the written law with air of legitimacy will be only resulted in complete default in discharge of judicial function. You cannot apply a statute which is written and remake it to your own to meet your own wishes at the same time. Now, I know the line of reasoning I have developed will not be acceptable to those who only look at the immediate effect of decision and ignore the long-run implication of assumption of judiciary of power of suspension. Now, I believe judicial suspension does more harm in long run than hard cases. Hard cases may have certain value, which is bringing those people who have their responsibility to the law and reminding them there is no principle of personal grace that can relieve their mistake of their representative. So in concluding, of course, I feel deeply that McLeish are insufficiently aware the danger implicit the conception of the judicial office advocated by my brother Foster. There I conclude the conclusion of this case should be affirmed.
I have listened and I cannot cease to amaze by my brother's ability to throw an obscuring curtain of legalism about every issue presented to them for decision. I hold the case to be one of the application of practical wisdom, not about abstract theory, and one of the easiest to decide. And then the government is a human affair in which people are ruled well when their rulers understand the feelings and conception of the masses. So, of all branches of the government, the judiciary is the most likely to lose its contact with the common man. When a set of facts has been subject to judicial treatment for sufficient time, all the life and juice have gone out of it and we have left a handful of dust. Moreover, distinction by lawyers between rules and principles which are ought or ought not to apply is a necessary evil, which is a consequence of a formal regulation. I prefer wide discretion and dispensation for the judiciary, save for a few things, which are conduct of elections and appointment of officials. In my view, I think we should take as our model the good administrator who accommodates procedures and principles to the case at hand, selecting from among the available forms those most suited to reach the proper result. And then the most obvious advantage of this method of government is that it permits us to go about our daily tasks with efficiency and common sense. The publicity surrounding the trial also, as well as the indication of the public opinion, which is 90% of the respondents to a major poll believe the explorers should be pardoned or given a token of punishment. And in my opinion, to preserve the accord between judiciary and public opinion, a declaration of innocence ought to be made. Certainly no layman would think that in letting this man off, we had stretched the statute any more than our ancestors did in the past. So my fellow brethren would think that it is no doubt that they will be horrified by the fact that the emotional and capricious public opinion. They will tell you that the law surrounds the trial of the case like this with elaborate safeguard designed to ensure that the truth will be known and that every rational considerations bearing on the issues of the case has been taken into account. And earlier in the judgment of my fellow brothers, Chief Justice Trupani and Tatting Justice want common sense to decide the case. Tatting Justice wants it prior to the trial at the prosecutor stage, and Chief Justice wants it after the case, and which means that neither of them wants to have a personal part in it. So also there does not appear in the poll made earlier that any public support for the Chief Justice's suggestion of upholding the verdict and requesting clemency. I also in doubt that the Chief Justice will grant clemency, provided with his conservative views and his personal knowledge that the Chief Justice Executive is determined not to commute the sentence if the verdict is upheld. In my view, last but not least, taking a common sense approach, the defendants are innocent and the conviction should be set aside.
So, I already listened to the court's decision and I acknowledge it. And therefore, my decision is firm on the law. I will not change or even mitigate or even grant pardon to all of you. With that, get ready this Friday for the sentence.
Huh? What? Friday? Today is Thursday. Tomorrow.
Tomorrow is Friday.
Tomorrow?
What?